dinosaur.
No.
Run for your lives. It's the Martian Daleks with phasers and stun guns.
No.
Well, who is it then?
I guess the kind of main themes that I deal with, which are about chance, unpredictability, about the flux of nature, which has all come from the natural world, which is what we live in, those kind of main themes can apply to any subject that gets thrown at me in a way. And I guess when I get commissioned work, I get asked to do work because the people asking me know the work I do, you know. So they kind of there's a certain inherent trust there. The work usually proceeds begins with research, and then certain seeds of ideas come out of that research that I think is contextually appropriate for the main kind of ideas that are being explored. And then the process of actual making something has to occur, you know. And it's that sort of process where things start changing again, you know. And of course, with the processes, I can't really guarantee what's going to happen because a lot of the materials and the ways I work physically are about being unpredictable. You know, I use things deliberately because they are unpredictable, because I do want to be surprised, even though I still want the ideas to be very contextually anchored. I want the processes to take me somewhere else sometimes, to surprise me, you know. I could probably trace this back to my childhood. I've just been really curious about the world and how things hook together all the time, you know. And then when I started to become aware that I was kind of good at art, so to speak, and then a little later when it became apparent that I was going to become an artist and would continue to be an artist, I would never like the idea of pigeonholes, of people being categorized into doing one thing and one thing only. I hated it. I couldn't understand it, you know. And maybe it's because of, again, my childhood, because I spent my childhood traveling a lot with my father, my parents, who was in the Air Force. So every 2 years we were somewhere else in the world. So I was this kind of foreign territories, foreign ideas, newness never was part of my landscape, you know, my language. It never freaked me out. I never felt bigoted or afraid of something that was foreign, you know. Whereas a lot of people of my own age group maybe who did stay at home and never really moved much, they are quite bigoted now, you know. So I think that's just part of my DNA now, that everything is interesting. Yeah. Everything is potentially interesting. And in terms of the art world, you know, when I went to art school, I couldn't stand this fact that I was just stuck in one department and you're supposed to study one thing. And I always look back at great artists who've survived the past, you know, like my main model, I guess, is Leonardo. And you look at him and you say, well, and you think, what would you call him? How would you categorize him? How would you pigeonhole him? You don't. And you celebrate that diversity and that fantastic mind, you know. But since I think it started here with art schools just after the Second World War, you know, it started to become very closed down. People were put into departments and you learned a skill or, you know, one thing. That was what you were supposed to study, you know. Prior to that, artists did all kinds of things. Even here, you know, during the war, the top artists in this country were commissioned to do posters and design buildings and wine labels and all sorts of things, you know, and they may have been considered before that to be purely painters. I think it was collage was a kind of language I discovered, I guess, late at school and then early at art school. And again, I think it came out of my childhood, of this moving around and taking bits of things all the time, parts of the world, little fragments of the world were coming into my life all the time, and you just kind of accommodate them. These things come together that shouldn't fit together, and they're like interesting. We lived at the first place we lived is a place called RAF Alhorn, which was down in the south somewhere. I don't remember it because I was only tiny, you know. But the real conscious time I remember was we lived at a place called RAF Bruggen, which was very close to, it was near Mönchengladbach, near Cologne, and very close to the Dutch border. And we lived in Holland for a year as well, in Eindhoven for a year, and then in this place called Bruggen. We had no television. Our only kind of link to British culture of any sort was the radio, and that was very limited. And we had what was called the Home Service, which was the BBC, you know, which is now Radio 1, 2, 3, 4, whatever. And there was a particular breed of kind of comic program that was on all the time in that period. Very kind of surreal, very English surrealism going on. A lot of sexual innuendo as well, which managed to get past all the censors, the BBC censors. And this was our lifeline to the UK, if you like, and British culture. This was the only thing we had every week on a Sunday, usually. You'd listen to this stuff and just laugh, you know. And we had Tony Hancock, who was a great, strange comedian. We had a show called Round the Horn, and the Navy Lark, and these were all daft, kind of surreal, pre-Monty Python, pre-all this. And, you know, and the Goon Show was Spike Milligan and the Goon Show was very important. And all these influenced Monty Python and subsequent British humour. But the one programme I remember in particular was a DJ called Jack Jackson, and he had his own programme. He used to be a band leader during the war, and then he started he was a radio DJ. But he physically used to cut up recording tape. He'd get recordings of the Goons, Tony Hancock, all the best comic programmes and recordings of the day, and physically splice up words and sentences and phrases, and then recollage them to make different kind of jokes that he used to he'd play a piece of music from the period, you know, and then this joke would begin in between that song and the next track. And it would carry on throughout an hour, these running jokes that were all made up of collage that had been made physically with, you know, a pair of scissors and tape. And it was the first kind of time that I'd really been exposed to any form of obvious collage, you know, and this juxtaposition of things that had come from different sources was like extraordinary to me. It made me laugh. It was kind of technically incredible. And it was just like mind-blowing, you know, what was coming out of this stuff. And that led me on to Kurt Schwitters and then the Beat Poets, William Burroughs, and all the cut-ups. And that was the introduction. I can't remember who said it. Some critic or art theorist said that collage is the most important idea of the 20th century. And he didn't mean just for the visual arts, you know, the whole idea of sticking stuff down on paper. He meant, I think, that it's sort of imbued in everything we do now. And I always saw it as a cultural parallel as well, in that we've had 2 world wars, you know. The whole world in a very relatively short period has been kind of shattered into fragments, and and it's increasingly so. We're living in an increasingly fragmented world. And on a day-to-day basis, everything we do is collage. Everything we receive is some form of collage. The way we take information in, the way we look at things, the way we listen to things is some form of collage. It's all little particles that come in to us, that surround us, bombard us, and we have to make sense of it somehow. It's the ultimate collage tool. It really is. As you stated before, you know, collage has come into every aspect of culture, you know, music, radio, television, comedy, film, art, visual art, sculpture, everything, which is fantastic. But so far, I see very little work done with computers that can't be done in another way, or that hasn't been done in a more traditional way. It's just a bit faster. As far as I know, sure, there are fantastic programs that you know, like synthetic or recorded orchestral arrangements, musicians' parts, you know, instruments, etc. It still doesn't quite sound like a person who plays it for live, you know, where every kind of nanosecond is unique. When I need to use a computer, I just bring work into the computer. It's just another tool, like a hammer is. You know. I'm not sure it has really. Again, I think it was like I was ready for punk when punk came along, because I'd already had a grounding, if you like, in coming from what I was saying earlier about the collage, the whole collage principle, and the sort of working with what one finds idea of Schwitters and others like that. And then coming through college and learning more and more about Dadaism. And punk just seemed to be like a kind of contemporary outburst of Dadaism, in a way. It was the spirit of it, of Dada, coming through punk, unconsciously maybe, on behalf of the people making the music and the whole scene. But it was you know, Dada came along at a time when, between the two world wars, where all the certainties of life, all the traditional values that people had been taught to respect up to that point had been blown apart, you know. No one could trust figures of authority. The moral kind of compass was spinning all around. And Dada's response to that was to just throw everything up in the air. Let's see what happens. Let's do something else, you know. We don't have to trust this stuff anymore. We can find a new language. And punk was doing exactly that, without actually being aware of its cultural background, you know. I was lucky being at the Royal College at the time I was, and as I explained to you earlier, that period, I was there 1974 to 77, was that three years or a couple of years either side of that period. The students in the department I was in were just amazing. It was like a creative engine, just red hot all the time, full of diversity and real talent, and everyone sort of talking to one another, being critical, being helpful. It was fantastic. And in that period, then punk emerged in the middle of it, you know. So I was in the right place at the right time, you know. I saw the Sex Pistols at the Royal College and the Clash, and I was going out 4 nights a week watching bands, you know. It's just that was my environment. It was like fish in water. It was quite natural. I think it was my degree show. You know what the degree show's like, this cattle market with thousands of people milling around. Simon Draper, who was the managing director with Richard Branson of Virgin Records, they were the two who ran it. So Richard used to run the money side of things. He'd do the accounts. They were really small then, you know. It was just them two, basically. And Simon was, he did everything else. He was the A&R man, he was the art director. He used to go to the studios and oversee production work. And he spotted my work and said, I've got some work for you to do. I'd never really thought about this, you know, didn't know how to do it, you know. So that's when I started getting work for music. One of the bands that had interested me, or one character, was Roxy Music and Brian Eno. And I decided to, I thought Eno's lyrics from his solo work were just extraordinarily Dadaistic. And I thought these would be an extraordinary kind of vehicle to allow me to explore collage, you know, without having to be honest to the lyrics. These were just springboards, tangents, you know, starting points. So I started doing all this work for my major project based on these lyrics, and I wrote to Brian via his management company with no ulterior motive, just thinking, I like his brain, I like the way he thinks, you know. I'd quite like to meet him just to talk about art, music, culture, whatever, women, football, anything. And I thought, I sent this letter off and thinking I won't get a reply, you know, there'll be secretaries there, they'll just bin it, you know. And about 6 weeks later I did get a reply, and Brian came into the Royal College, we met and we got on very well, and I started working with him as well, doing album covers and working with stage sets and lighting and video stuff. and I just found his mind was like mine. You know, it's like all over the place. These ideas coming and meshing. Well, again, this was all chance mainly. I'd been doing installation work, you know, multimedia installation work, in which sound was kind of central. And one of them, I'd put out a little limited edition CD of the sound piece for sale at the gallery or wherever it was, and it had somehow got to a little label in Nottingham. And the directors of this tiny little independent label contacted me and said, "Would you like to do an album for us?" And I foolishly said yes. And then I panicked. How am I going to do this? You know, because a lot of the work I'd done on the installation work is field recordings and very abstract stuff, you know. And then I thought, well, no, actually, I don't want to do an album like that. I've been given a chance to do something I really want to do, so I want to do something that's more rock, pop, experimental, you know, art school music, basically. And then I panicked again, having committed. I thought I can do some of this myself, you know, but I can't really come up with a whole album's worth on my own. And then I started thinking, what am I really about, you know? And it came back to the collage idea again. So and at that point I'd worked with quite a lot of really good musicians who, a lot of them had become good friends, you know, who I'd socialise with and talk about everything under the sun. So I just thought, well, I'll just ask them if they just give me a sound, anything, not prescribed at all. And all of them did, you know. All of them were generous enough to give me either at least one and sometimes hundreds, you know. From Kevin Shields from My Bloody Valentine, I got 100 guitar noises. You know. and then I went into the studio to work with two engineers who I'd never met before. I was given, I think it was like 10 days, non-stop, just do this album, you've got to have it finished. So it was tiring and exciting, and big learning curve. And of course these two engineers had never worked like this either. They'd worked with musicians, you know, and I don't work like that. I was kind of throwing ideas at them, throwing a sound, you know, here's a sound, let's put it next to this sound and see what happens. And then an idea would start forming, a direction would start emerging, and then I'd maybe illustrate what was going through my head in a visual term. So, well, I want it to be like a shoal of fish turning in a blink of an eyelid. And they go, what the fuck are you talking about? Is that the middle eight? Or are we talking about the bridge here or the chorus? No. It's at a frustrating stage because we've been working on this for years with lots of very long gaps in between. There are essentially three of us now who are the core beings of Undark, and in the last sort of 10 years we've all had various personal troubles and disturbances to deal with, you know, like relationships breaking down and divorces and deaths and things, and employment problems, you know. And so we're not a unit as like a band, we're not tight like that. So we come together when we can, which is difficult, you know. And one of the other members lives in Nottingham, which is not easy either. So it's taking far too long. And every time we come back to it, we kind of think, oh, initially we think this is really exciting. And then because we've heard it so much at that stage, we kind of think, we've got to freshen this up somehow. So then we start tinkering with it again, completely dismantling it, and deconstructing it, and then trying to build it again. And it just goes on and on, you know. So we're still at that point, and we've kind of determined that the next time we have the opportunity to get together with a real focus on this, we're going to really deconstruct it completely. You know? And like everything else, I don't know where it's going to go. I don't quite know. I came across his work when I was first at art school. I sort of read everything I could get hold of. Just when I was on foundation, in fact, I became completely hooked on his work. And at that time, I was really confused. I didn't know what I was doing in terms of art. You know, I was very young. You know, I was the youngest person at this art school at the time, and I'd come out of an RAF background. You know, service, military, and a boarding school, straight to art school, where everyone had hair down here, and I still had a really short haircut. You know, and I was calling some of the art tutors sir still. You know. Yeah, Scott Walker, who I've liked for years since he was with the Walker Brothers. I loved their stuff, you know, that what amazing voice, you know. And but I admire his spirit, you know, that he went from being in this incredibly popular pin-up poster boy band, who at the time had a bigger fan base than the Beatles. And he sort of turned his back on that. You know, he could have gone to somewhere like Las Vegas and do those residencies that these balladeers always do. And he decided not to follow that path at all. And he stayed in London, and he just dived into a very kind of European, very kind of existentialist almost exploration of culture, which has come into his work. And I do genuinely believe he's one of the most experimental musicians working at the moment. One of the things, Scott Walker is leading me back to Samuel Beckett, why Samuel Beckett was very important for me and still is, was his continual fight against form. And again, this goes back to pigeonholing, you know, labelling something. By labelling something, you immediately cut down the possibilities of what that thing can be. And Beckett was always fighting against this. He didn't want to call what he did something. He didn't want to give it a name, because that immediately constrains the potential of it. And it seems as though that's getting worse, I think, in the cultural world. You know, you have to be one thing or the other. You have to fit it into a convenient little lazy box to be taken seriously. If you do something that happens to span several areas of discipline, you're looked at very suspiciously, you know. On the surface, I'm suspicious of it all, and I don't particularly like it. But then, if one considers it for a little longer, you actually and look back. This is nothing. What's going on now is not new. You know, this you could probably trace this back to the Renaissance in a way, where a Medici would, almost like a football team, would seek the next striker. You know, the best striker in Europe to play and pay them a load of money. That's what was going on in the Medici period and the Renaissance period. So various Medicis were vying with each other to get the best artists, the best musicians, the best craftspeople, the best choirs. You know. And that was their kind of show of wealth, if you like, kudos, and commission them to do extraordinary works to compete with Medici John Smith over here, you know. So I don't think, in essence, it's no different from that, but it's become very, I guess in the Renaissance time and since, artists were being commissioned to do what they do best, you know. Whereas now, as far as I can see, you know, since the 90s, I guess, well, maybe the late 80s, I think it started to go really sour and cynical, is that artists have started to think, how do I get big? How do I become famous? How do I become successful? And they've been tailoring their work to that end. Well, I remember I was with a gallery in London at the time called Moira Kelly Gallery, and she was considered to be quite hip and sharp about talent, what was going on. But she was very genuine as well. She wasn't false. And she told me a story about being visited by a woman from New York who just teamed up with Leo Castelli Gallery in New York, who was the big kind of mafioso of the art world from Warhol onwards. He'd looked after all of those artists, you know, And this woman, Mary Boone, had hooked up with Leo Castelli. She'd gone to him and said, I want to start a new gallery, you know. And he basically said, here's how you do it. And she said, I've got this artist that no one's heard of. He's a big, blousy guy who does these paintings. His name is Julian Schnabel. But no one's heard of him. What do I do? And so he said, this is how you do it. I've got my equivalent of my little black book, you know. I've got all my contacts, my buyers, people who've bought from me. And this is how it's done. I'll phone them up. I'll tell them, we have this amazing new young artist showing. I'm giving you the opportunity to buy one of his paintings now, before anyone else sees this work. And if you buy this painting for however many $1,000, I'll guarantee that in 3 years' time it will be worth 3 times as much. So of course, Castelli has a very good reputation. These people are all multimillionaires. They bought from him before. They know they can't lose on this, you know. It's a done deal. So they all buy this work before the first show has even opened. So the publicity for the first show goes out. Amazing new show by young artist, sells out. Suddenly he's a superstar, you know. And on the back of that kind of mentality that was kind of seeping around predominantly New York, it then shifted to Europe and England. The next thing that I noticed anyhow was artists deliberately making work that was enormous, just size. And the reasoning for this was that the only people who could afford to buy them and to show them were major museums. So they were tailoring their work to fit these sort of high palaces of art. And I just found it so cynical, all this, you know. And it's still in that sort of territory now, I think, sadly. And if you're not part of that game, if you're not pressing the flesh in London and wherever, if you don't want to join in, you're completely isolated. You're just ostracized from that world. And particularly someone like me, because I'm not a painter, you know. I'm not a sculptor. I'm not one thing. That's the problem with this country in the arts. They don't like people doing more than one thing. They get very suspicious, or they accuse you of kind of spreading your talents too thinly. Several reasons. We were just about to have a child. I'd grown very tired of London, I guess. I thought I'd kind of done it all, really, London. And I was getting really fed up with people always telling you what you've got to do. You know, what is the next thing? What is the big hip thing to do? You like, go and see this film, see this band, this exhibition, go and buy this bit of equipment. You know, if you haven't got this, you're nothing, you know. And I thought, actually, I'm interested in these little things over here that are not part of this cultural landscape that you're so desperate to be part of. I'm interested in these little ideas over here. And I find I'm spending so much time defending myself and fending off all these other invasions. I just thought I really need some time to think, you know. And I'd been coming up here for years on holidays and things, and also I'd been up and done a sculpture up here, a commission in Grisdale Forest. And while I was up doing that over a few weeks, I kind of got more absorbed into the community, the landscape, the people. And I also realised it was much cheaper to be here, and you could get a bigger house and a studio. And the pace of life was very attractive. I think, yeah, and also, you know, a child was on the way, and I thought, I don't really want to bring up a child in London. Possibly not evidently, not obviously, you know. I do get a lot from being here in terms of inspiration and ideas, in terms of, as I said right at the beginning, about the work being about flux, about natural phenomenon, using nature as a model, as a teacher almost. But I've always felt that anyhow. I guess I'm closer to it now, you know, that's all. The quiet. The best thing, was an unconscious decision, was which has just happened over time, which is to not have an agent and to not be represented by anyone or obliged to anyone. So I've been a completely free, I call myself a self-unemployed artist. You know? And the worst, I suppose, which is contrary to what I've been talking about before, was moving out of London to move to an area in the country. Not because it was a bad decision, but because people in London, the people who commissioned my work, had a mental block about the physical distance. And so paradoxically, I lost a lot of potential work because of moving out of London. And on the one hand, that was kind of dangerous financially, and on the other hand, I didn't give a shit, really. I was quite pleased to escape all that. Yeah, I think it's been kind of very important for two reasons, I guess. One was I was so grateful for having been able to go through the English art school system when I did. I probably couldn't say that now about going through the English art school system. It was so extraordinarily liberal and mind-expanding. So when I was asked to get into teaching, I felt I owe the art school system this because of what it did for me, you know. So that's one reason it's important. And secondly is contact with students. Just seeing a student find their own voice, just observing, watching, and being part of that process, helping someone, is really uplifting, you know. When you see a student who's got little grains of ideas, but they're still sort of scrambling around with other people's ways of working, if you like. You know, they've referenced so much, they haven't found their own voice yet. And then trying to get them to ignore all this other stuff, ignore the art world, ignore all the art magazines, just be really honest and explore this one little idea that you have and forget. Don't even think that it may be art or not. Just to forget all that. Just explore it, you know. And then to see them getting hold of that idea and really making something new out of it, that it surprises them, you know. It's fantastic. I understand why it happens, but I think it's very lazy, you know. And what worries me is at the beginning of the process, if you like, and you know, going back to teaching, when I'm teaching students, they're so concerned about the form. You know, what is it I'm doing? Not in terms of why am I doing this? What is the essence of this thing I'm doing? They want to give it a name straight away. It's printmaking. It's painting. It's sculpture. It's this. Well, I want stuff to be hybrid. I want stuff that I've never seen or heard or smelt before, you know. I want to go back to the Susan Sontag quote. I want to be nervous.
The Mona Lisa has been stolen, boy. Stolen from the, how do you pronounce this?
Louvre. L-O-U-V-R-E, pronounced
Louvre. Louvre.
Louvre. Louvre. Louvre.
Yeah, you have a choice of 20.